is Sam. I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager here at Fairygodboss, and Fairygodboss is the largest career community for women. Our mission is to improve the workplace by increasing transparency. We offer a ton of great free resources like anonymous company reviews, job listings, articles, virtual recruiting events, and so much more to help you succeed throughout your career. We will be recording today's webinar and sending it out in a follow-up email later today. So if you missed anything or you want to rewatch this back, you will have the ability to do so. We'll also be taking questions at the end of today's webinar. You can find the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to leave questions as yourself or anonymously, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. Here with me today is Sarah McMullen, an inclusion strategist and consultant with Getting Hired. Sarah works with employers to attract, hire, and support individuals and veterans with disabilities by creating inclusive candidate experiences, processes, and internal cultures. She has spent her professional career providing consultation and strategies to talent acquisition teams within Fortune 500 companies on disability inclusion, talent attraction, and employee retention. She attributes her passion for education and advocacy on these topics to her formal professional experiences in working at a nonprofit for people with disabilities and personal experiences in having close family members with non-apparent disabilities. Thank you so much for being here today, Sarah. I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. And thank you to everybody who has joined us today, and also to Fairygodboss. I'm a huge fan of Fairygodboss. I am a member of the VIP community as well. So just incredible, great resources, and really appreciate you all having me here for this discussion today. I'm presenting with you all on behalf of Getting Hired. We are an organization that is working with employers throughout the country to help them attract, hire, and retain individuals and veterans with disabilities. I want to emphasize the retention part of it, because one of the biggest parts of the partnership that we have with our employer companies is not only on that talent attraction and the hiring piece, but then helping organizations to understand how they can best support, accommodate, retain, even promote their current employees and new hires, individuals with disabilities in the workplace, and create that level of inclusion as well, which is so hugely important today. I want to provide a disclaimer quickly that what I'm sharing with you all today is not legal advice in any kind of way. It is general information and recommendations from industry expertise, from information that I have gathered along my professional career from job seekers and employers and my experiences along the way, but then also information from the EEOC, JAN or Job Accommodation Network, and the ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act. So what we're going to cover today, first and foremost, I always like to set the landscape. So what is the definition of a disability and what are examples? What employers and interviewers can and can't ask you during an interview, how to respond to tough or potentially illegal questions, and knowing your rights during an interview, and always having questions at the end of the presentation as well will help with our discussion. So please feel free to make note of any questions that you have along the way. We should absolutely have time for those at the end. Feel free to enter those into the chat box as well. I know Sam is monitoring that. So first, I want to go over the definition of a disability. As you can see, according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the definition that's listed in front of you is pretty broad. It's essentially an impairment that limits one or more major life activities, a record of such impairment as well, and major life activities as defined, where you can see right here, include caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, breathing, learning, concentrating, and working. Major bodily functions have been added to this definition as well, and that includes functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. It's a mouthful, but the reason why I'm mentioning each of these definitions and categories of what's included in here is that I wanted to really take a step back and say, what comes to mind when everybody hears that word disability? When you think about a person with a disability, society media, social media, advertisements have all taught us that and conditioned us to think that it's somebody in a wheelchair, somebody who has an apparent disability, let's say an amputee potentially, somebody who needs constant assistance because of a cognitive disability that they may have, when in fact, that is not an accurate representation of the entire disability population. More times than not, disabilities are non-apparent. So over 70%, in fact, of disabilities are non-apparent. 1 in 4 Americans has a disability, and over 80% are acquired through our lifetime. Examples are not limited to, but they do include the list that you see in front of you here, including diabetes, epilepsy, ADHD, dyslexia, various learning disabilities, PTSD, low vision, traumatic brain injuries, potential COVID-19 complications, and long-term effects or side effects that you might have from that if you in fact contract that. So the reason why, again, I bring all of this up is first and foremost to have everybody understand that you might have something that is actually considered to be a disability. It just really hasn't come up before in conversation, or you haven't thought of it in that way, or it hasn't been presented to you in that way either. And these are just all examples of things that are considered to be disabilities according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. But it's ultimately up to you to decide if you identify with any one of these things. I also wanted to call out the fact that employers are interested in hiring with people with disabilities. We all have probably seen it. 2020 especially, I think, really accelerated any initiatives, any focus on increasing diversity and inclusion initiatives within organizations, within corporate America. But that does include people with disabilities as well. So if anybody's ever wondering, do organizations want to hire people with disabilities? Are they truly interested in that? My answer would be yes. In working with the employers that Getting Hired has partnerships with, that is the main reason why they are working with us, is that they have this interest in figuring out the right way to, in fact, hire, support, accommodate, and retain individuals and veterans with disabilities. And so these are just a couple of news headlines, and these aren't all necessarily new either. They didn't all occur in 2020, but just to show you what has been in the space, to see that in fact there have been business cases around the value of hiring people with disabilities, the financial benefit as well to organizations that are inclusive of people with disabilities, the focus from a consumer standpoint. CVS created a new app that could help read prescription labels. They created prescription labels as well in larger print in Braille, which is incredible just to see that type of change. Nike, you all have probably seen, they created a new shoe for people with disabilities, a hands-free shoe. Intel, as part of their 2020 plans and announcement, the article on the right-hand side, I highlighted the sentence, they've pledged to increase the percentage of employees who self-identify as having a disability up to 10% of their workforce over the next decade. So to give you all a benchmark, Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act requires federal contractors and subcontractors to have 7% of their workforce represented as people with disabilities. So Intel is going for a 10% goal over the next decade. So now I want to talk about questions that employers and interviewers are allowed to ask you or not ask you, just to go over, again, your rights and awareness around this. So in terms of what employers can't ask you, they cannot ask you, and again, this is the pre-offer stage, so there are some differences between pre and post-offer, but pre-offer stage, they cannot ask disability specific or related questions. Do you have a disability? Asking about specific disabilities, even if you have something apparent. So let's say that you are in a wheelchair. Let's say that you are using some kind of device. I know it might be a little bit harder to tell since a lot of us are still doing interviews or interacting with one another over video versus in person. But if you're using anything else that makes your disability apparent or visual in some kind of way, they cannot ask additional questions to dive into that. In general, they cannot ask about any impairments or health conditions. They cannot ask what or if any medications are being taken, any sick days in your current or previous jobs, about any job related injuries or workers' compensation history. And any of this information could obviously lead them to the conversation or questions that ask about a disability, which is one of the reasons why they can't ask about sick days or workers' compensation history. And then the ability to perform major life activities, unless it's truly relevant and required to perform the job. For example, an employer or interviewer could not ask about your ability to walk or stand. Again, I only use this example because it's something apparent, but let's say that you are in a wheelchair, you're a wheelchair user, you use a cane, a crutch, something visual and apparent like that. That interviewer seeing that device cannot therefore ask or be prompted to ask about your ability to walk or stand a long period of time unless it's required for the job. So, if an essential function of the job requires you to be able to stand without discomfort for 2 hours, let's say, then they can ask about your ability to, will you be able to stand for 2 hours without discomfort? As long as it's a question that they ask all candidates. So again, it can't be targeted towards an apparent disability that they're seeing or something that's been disclosed to them or they assume that you have. In terms of what they can ask you, of course, all questions can be related to the essential functions of the job. In fact, that is what we recommend to employers is to keep all questions related to that. That's going to ensure that all candidates are receiving the same experience, they're receiving the same types of questions as well, and you're not diving into potentially more personal questions that you shouldn't be asking. They can also ask if a reasonable accommodation might be needed for the hiring process. Asking especially for next steps, will you need a reasonable accommodation for any additional steps in this hiring process? And they can ask for documentation of a disability if that's part of their process. If that is required, it might be something as simple as a doctor's note, medical note, something else just showing that you do in fact have a disability, if that's needed. They can ask for a description of how you would perform a job function. We've all heard those types of questions of, tell me about a time, or can you describe to me how you would perform this or X? And if an accommodation is requested for you to either demonstrate something, I know a lot of employers as well will sometimes ask within the interview process a candidate to participate in an activity or an exercise, participate in some kind of assessment, maybe show how they can code something if they're applying for that type of position as well. If an accommodation is needed to perform any of those, you can, of course, ask for that and let the employer know. And the employer, in turn, must allow you to simply describe how you would perform the job function if that's what you prefer to do instead of physically performing something, especially while we're over video remote interviews. That's definitely something that they are supposed to allow you to do. And they have to provide that accommodation if it doesn't create an undue hardship. And an undue hardship is defined as something that requires extensive or extreme cost or modification to their existing processes. So, for example, if they wanted you to take some kind of pre-assessment or test, and as an accommodation, you needed that in a larger print, That's not going to cost an extreme amount of money. That's an accommodation that the employer should be able to provide to you in providing a larger print assessment in order for you to take. They can ask about apparent injuries or quote unquote impairments, so long as it's not diving into that underlying condition. And I just bring this up as an example because I don't want it to feel like interviewers and employers aren't allowed to just ask conversation or ask questions that make conversation or things that they notice. So for example, if let's say you broke your arm, you're wearing a cast and that's something that is obviously apparent, that person might naturally say, "Hey, how'd you break your arm?" Or "What happened? Are you okay?" Those questions are totally fine and legal for them to ask. Now, if they try to dive deeper and ask, "Oh, are you expected to heal normally? Are there any other complications that are being expected? Or when do you expect that you'll be fully healed?" Those are diving into now potentially asking about a disability that could result, something that you might have already as a disability or condition. And that's where they cannot ask those questions. Employers as well can ask about any current illegal use of drugs. I think we've all seen that kind of standard within application processes, and they absolutely can ask that. And they can also ask ask you to participate in a physical fitness test, again, if that is required and asked of all candidates within that same job function or category, so long as it's not turning into a medical exam. So I'll give you an example. If you are applying for a job with the police force, you might be asked to participate in a physical fitness test before you are formally brought on board, offered the position, and let's say that as part of that, you have to run 1 mile in 12 minutes. That's perfectly fine. They can ask you to do that. It's something that's standard. They're asking every candidate to do. But once they start measuring, or if they try to measure any physiological responses, like your heart rate, like your blood pressure, anything else that could be an additional side effect or how your body is responding to that mild test, that turns it into a medical exam. That information is not necessary for them to know. It was only necessary for them to know if you could or could not run that 1 mile within 12 minutes. So post offer, what I want to remind everybody of is even with the questions that can be asked, what cannot happen, what employers are not allowed to do is persuade, coerce in any type of way you to disclose medical information. That cannot be forced to happen. So, in terms of then what can be asked now post offer, disability related questions and requests for medical examinations can occur and can be asked for. Again, if it's standard to ask all new hires in the same job function or job category this information. They can't see you as somebody who has disclosed a disability or somebody who has an apparent disability and now only ask you these questions. And any obtained medical information as well must be kept confidential. It can be shared with a couple of different parties, including supervisors, decision makers in the hiring process as well. Anybody that needs to know about this information, government officials that might be conducting compliance or audit reviews around ADA compliance for the organization, if that's necessary. Those are some of examples of individuals and parties that the information can be shared with. Employers can also now ask about sick leave and workers' compensation history, and they can ask if a reasonable accommodation is needed for the job and documentation of a disability as well. So that's a little bit more about what can and can't be asked at the post-offer stage. And I want to stress as well that offers cannot be withdrawn because of a disability, only if you're unable to perform the essential functions of the job. So now, even though they can ask disability-related questions, request you to participate in a medical examination, etc., they can't withdraw a job offer just because you did in fact disclose that yes, you have a disability, or you don't want to participate in something. So I just wanted to pause there really quick. Sam, are there any immediate questions that you wanted to chime in with, or should I continue?
I think we can keep going for now.
Okay, perfect. So I wanted to talk a little bit more accommodations because this is a really big part about the hiring process, the support process afterwards, ensuring that you have everything that you need to be able to equally participate within the job process, or somebody is a new employee now. So for one, reiterating that employers can ask if you need an accommodation to perform the job if a disability is disclosed, if it's standard to ask every candidate, and they cannot ask additional questions about that underlying condition. Employers must then provide reasonable accommodations for the application process, hiring process, and job if no, again, undue hardship or significant difficulty or expense results from that. Some examples of accommodations that might be requested during the hiring process could be providing written materials in accessible formats like large print, braille, or audio tape, providing readers or ASL interpreters, providing in-person or for in-person interviews. Once again, we get to that point, or if those are occurring in any kind of way, they must occur in accessible locations. And then modifying formats of tests or allowing for extra time as well. Examples of accommodations potentially for the job are a flexible or alternative work schedule, ergonomic office equipment, an available quiet space in the office to work, or a larger computer monitor or a screen reader. And I give all these examples as well because, for one, majority of these examples of accommodations for the job are ones that a lot of people, disability or not, are asking for, like a flexible or alternative work schedule, ergonomic office equipment. Employers are understanding that creating opportunity for these types of accommodations proactively are benefiting their employees and candidates proactively, and all candidates and all employees as well. These are also typically items that would not impact your ability to perform the essential functions of the job. And employers also, just for you to know your rights, cannot ask about accommodations that don't relate to the essential functions or requirements for the job. So, for example, it's unnecessary for them to ask, hey, by the way, would you be able to, or would you need a reasonable accommodation to get to the parking lot or to get to the cafeteria that we have in the building? That really doesn't have anything to do with the essential functions of the job. It might be that they're trying to kind of, in a roundabout way, ask about a disability, ask about the ability to do something, but it doesn't have anything to do with the essential functions of the job, and isn't necessary. Understanding accommodations, I always like to provide a couple tips to really set yourself up for success if you are requesting an accommodation or if you need one. For one, I always recommend that you inform your employer as soon as possible about the need for any reasonable accommodation, but you are not required to disclose anything that might be needed in the very distant future. This is really only about, do you need a reasonable accommodation now for anything in the hiring process or for the job? That's going to really just set you up for success and be able to perform at your best potential. I highly recommend looking for the company's accommodation statement. It always helps to just have as much information proactively as possible. A couple places where you might be able to find that are on the company's website, either in the footer of the website. We recommend that employers include the accommodation statement within every single job description as well, or if there's a dedicated diversity and inclusion page within the company website, that's another place that you might find it, or with the EEO link or statement that they might have hyperlinked at the bottom of the site as well. It's also good feedback for you if, or for the employer, if you look for that statement, especially if you do in fact need the information within it, and you can't find it, that's direct feedback on the candidate experience that they are providing. So that's something else that you can also just let them know about. I recommend being as explicit as possible and saying, I would like to request a reasonable accommodation. I need a reasonable accommodation. And the reason why I say this is that is the education that is being provided to employers. So, for one, trying to kind of bridge that gap as much as I possibly can between job seekers and employers. And I completely understand that it might come out in a different way. It's not always going to come out as direct as that and saying, I need to request a, and then using the words reasonable accommodation. It might be saying, do you provide, you know, standing desks for all employees? Do you allow for flexible work schedules, and you're trying to get a feel for things? And there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, you can do that. But if you do, in fact, need an accommodation, employers, recruiters, hiring managers are often trained that with this language, that job seekers with disabilities might need reasonable accommodations. And so, if anything outside of that and not as direct as that is being asked for, if that's the wording being used, sometimes a recruiter or hiring manager might not pick up on it and realize that that is in fact a reasonable accommodation request. They might just think that you're asking a general question. So that's why I say make it easier for them if you're able to. And then on the employer side, we always let them know, of course, it might not be as direct. So here's some other ways that it might sound if someone's requesting an accommodation. So really just trying to make communication as easy as possible between job seekers and employers as well. I always recommend to be prepared to explain how the accommodation will allow you to fully participate in the application or the hiring process. You don't have to come right out and say that, to say, I need an accommodation and here's how it's going to allow me to do this. But especially if there's a question, or if you just want to address it up front and saying, here is the accommodation that I need. I need this assessment in a larger print that will allow me to fully complete it to my fullest potential and give you the best responses possible. That just gives a little explanation as to why, in fact, it's needed. It's out of necessity. Have a suggestion or example ready to provide, especially if it's something for the workplace. Even to say, hey, do you have a designated quiet space in the office to work? And if they don't, maybe it's, would I be able to bring in noise canceling headphones? It's something that you're providing. It's no additional cost to the employer. And again, providing explanation as to why that might be needed, the benefit that that provides, and the fact that you can provide that yourself. Know that alternative options are allowed to be offered by employers. If that alternative option doesn't meet your needs, be ready to explain why it doesn't, if that's the case. So employers are not required to give you exactly what you need. So if somebody needs a screen reader, let's say, if you request a certain screen reader software or version, employers are not required to provide that exact one. They might provide something else or suggest something else. If that doesn't meet your needs, you should be ready to educate and to explain why you need the other version, if that truly is the case. And just know your rights. Know what employers, again, are and are not allowed to ask you. Be prepared as possible for the request, for the conversation, and for the process. Self-identification. I always like to cover this because a lot of people don't realize that self-identification and self-disclosure are actually two separate things. And that's because the words are often used interchangeably. But self-identification is the process of what I call checking the box. So the self-identification form that you see on the left-hand side, this is the just a screenshot of the most recent version of the self-ID form. This is something that you've probably seen in your application processes. You've probably received from your employers when they ask you to potentially update your demographic or personal information at the end of the year or on a yearly basis. It is simply checking the box that yes, you do, you don't, or you don't wish to disclose that you have a disability. with self-identification requests, questionnaires, forms like this, it has to be clearly stated by the employer that it's being used for compliance or affirmative action reasons. It is voluntary. It is not required for you to participate in this, and choosing not to participate in it is not going to negatively impact consideration, your consideration as a candidate or a hire. The form also needs to be kept confidential and should therefore be kept separate from the application to keep that confidential as well. So that's, again, what employers must do. So if employers haven't been upfront about that, if you've wondered what is done with that information, this gives you some insight into that. And then self-disclosure is different than that. Self-disclosure is the act of, most times, verbally telling somebody that you have a disability and disclosing that information about yourself. Self-identification is more related to a process that usually happens at standard times, again, in the application process and the onboarding process, maybe on a yearly basis to update information. Self-disclosure can occur at any time, anywhere, to anyone. It can be as informal and simple as me talking to my colleague that I've known for 3 years and letting them know about a disability that I have that I just never felt comfortable to disclose until that point. Maybe it's an accommodation that I now need and I'm not sure how to talk to my manager about it. I'm seeking advice. If any colleagues come to you and they share this information with you, it is always best practice to keep that information confidential unless somebody gives you permission to share it with someone else. Like anything else, self-disclosure about a disability is really, as a person, getting to the place where you feel comfortable enough to share something very personal about yourself with someone else. So that it should be taken very seriously. In terms of disclosure, when you are applying for jobs, it's totally up to you. Again, you could check the box on the self identification form. You've self identified now. It doesn't mean you've self disclosed. Or you could self disclose, but then not self identify. It's within your right to choose what you feel comfortable doing and not doing. Options for self disclosure include in a cover letter, maybe in additional documentations or websites. There was a job seeker that I was working with, and to show all of the projects and accomplishments that she had from a coding standpoint, from a website development standpoint, she had a hyperlink to a website for herself, showing, again, all of those different projects, giving more information about herself. At the beginning, she had a couple paragraphs explaining who she was as a person to get to know her as a person first. She disclosed her disability. And some basic information about that and what that meant, and therefore how that was an asset or what she was looking for. So that's an example of providing that within your documentation or cover letter up front. It can be disclosed again during the interview process, during the hiring process, after the job offer. At any point during your employment, you could be an employee that's 25 years tenured and now you decide to disclose that information. It's also within your rights to never share that information if you don't feel comfortable to. But when you do disclose, I recommend as best practices to share general information about the disability, discuss why you're disclosing or share why you're disclosing that information. If it has any impact on your ability to do the job, and then again, help the employer out or your manager out. Are there any accommodations that you need? Are there any that have been provided to you in the past that would be helpful for you in this role as well? So now at this time, I wanted to go through a couple example scenarios and just kind of put it into practice a little bit. So the first question is, a candidate discloses during the interview that they will need to take 2 short breaks during the workday to take medication. Is the interviewer allowed to ask any additional questions? And I'll just give you a second. You can think about this to yourself. You can chat with somebody. If you're with someone right now, you can put it in the chat box, either one. We don't have a formal poll for it, but. So the answer is yes. The interviewer may ask how long the breaks need to be and if this will be every day for further understanding or just the frequency in general. However, they cannot ask what the medication is for, what the medication specifically is, or how long they have been on it. They are also not responsible for saying whether the request will be approved. And the second one, a candidate with low vision is interviewing for a graphic design position and discloses their disability to the interviewer. Is the interviewer allowed to ask about their disability or if they will need a reasonable accommodation? I'll give you a second here. So the answer is no. The interviewer is not allowed to ask additional questions about the disclosed disability, but they can ask if the person will need a reasonable accommodation to perform the essential functions of the job since a disability has been disclosed. If the answer is no, then the interviewer may not ask additional questions about the accommodation, but they can ask and allow the individual to describe how they would perform the essential functions of that job. So essentially, walk me through a time, tell me how you would perform this particular function. And if yes, they can ask for details on the accommodation specifically. Again, not about the disability or anything that was disclosed, but for example, would you need a screen reader? Would you need a certain brand? Kind of going back to that example that we talked about earlier. Is there a certain version that you would need? And then again, be prepared to provide additional information or education around what exactly you might need. COVID-19, I felt that it was appropriate to include some information about this. There's a lot of questions. I do not have all of the answers. I think a lot of answers are still being determined in terms of what employers are legally required to provide or not to provide. But here is kind of a summary of some of what's out there that I felt was relevant and important for you all to know as related to this discussion. For one, employers can delay the start date for your job offer if you have a diagnosis or if you are exhibiting symptoms of having COVID-19. Job offers can be withdrawn if you are needed to start immediately. So if that has been discussed, determined, agreed upon, but then you're unable to start immediately because of COVID-19 or symptoms related to that. Protection is potentially available for employees with pre-existing disabilities who are at higher risk of COVID-19, who need reasonable accommodations to remain home when everyone is asked to return. So essentially, if everybody's asked to return to the office, if for some reason it's determined that you must do the job within the office and you cannot do it from home, and you still are considered high risk because of a pre-existing condition, it absolutely might be a case where you are protected under the ADA or legally because your reasonable accommodation is to remain home or have a flexible work schedule, maybe only come in a couple times a week. And employees receiving reasonable accommodations prior to COVID-19 may be entitled to additional or altered accommodations. And again, that's a discussion to have with your employer. It's something that I would recommend researching further. And we do have resources that will be sent out via email as well afterwards for some of the articles from EEOC, from Job Accommodation Network, from Department of Labor and ADA as well on that. But ultimately, I recommend talking to your employer if you needed something like ergonomic equipment that you had in the office, but now you need it at home because of your disability. And employers do have the right to request additional documentation or information for reasonable accommodation requests due to medical conditions during COVID-19. So if they need any kind of additional documentation to show that you do in fact have a medical condition during this pandemic for any requests, they of course can still ask for that information. So responding to tough or legal questions, there are a lot, of course, that are out there related to gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, even whether or not, depending on marital status, if you're a parent, kind of every demographic you can think of. This is just an example for if you're asked if you have a disability, but it can be applied generally to kind of any of those questions. So again, this is assuming that, again, pre-offer stage, somebody asks if you have a disability, or if you've been singled out post-offer stage, if it's not standard that they ask this of all candidates, but you're asked this question. There are a couple different ways that you can respond. One is just you can choose not to answer. So you can say, I prefer to stick to questions that are related to the essential functions for this role, or now that after the information we've covered, that question makes me a little uncomfortable and I'm not sure if it's prohibited by law. You can ask about the relevancy and kind of say, hey, it's an interesting question. I've never been asked that during an interview before. Can you tell me why you've asked? Can you clarify which essential function this is related to? You can answer what you think is the underlying concern behind the question. So for example, I think you're asking about my ability to perform the essential functions of this role, which my experience almost perfectly aligns with. I'd be happy to talk you through how I would, and then perform whatever function. I'm more than qualified and able to perform the essential functions and requirements of this role. So just validate for them that you can in fact do that. Highlight your accomplishments, successes, certificates, education, skills that align with the requirements, and how you would be an asset to the company. You can also answer directly. Yes, I was diagnosed with epilepsy as a teenager, and I'm very interested in working for a company that is dedicated to the inclusion and equity for people with disabilities. Apologies for the typo there, but can you tell me about your company's culture and initiatives around that? So turn it back on them, turn it into a conversation. But remember that you are not required to share details about your disability. And I would recommend making note of any questions that you have been asked that might potentially be prohibited by law or illegal per se. And if you are hired, maybe bring that up to your manager or HR. That can help to provide an education point in conversation. It might also be something that requires further action afterwards if you feel that there's been any discrimination. So in summary, it's important just to, again, know your rights. You are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act requires employers with 15 or more employees to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified applicants and employees. The definition of a disability is very broad, so it's essentially up to you to determine if you consider yourself to have one. Self-identification does not mean self-disclosure, and I recommend requesting any needed accommodations early on. Employers are not required to provide all reasonable accommodations. Any collected medical information must be kept confidential, with exceptions around decision makers involved in the hiring process, supervisors or managers, as well as government officials that might be looking into ADA compliance information. Pre-offer, employers and interviewers cannot ask disability-related questions, and be prepared to answer tough questions and make note of any illegal questions that are in fact asked. And these are just some resources. This is where some of the information came from, and these are also all links that will be sent to you all afterwards as well via email if you want to take a look into some more specifics and read about some additional scenarios that you might have encountered, or you're just curious what employers are and are not allowed to do and what your rights are as well. So at this point, Sam, are there any questions? I want to thank you all again for your time, for joining us today and for this discussion, but would love to open the floor to anything you've received.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that really informative presentation. And yes, we've had a ton of questions come in. Just as a reminder, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A. I saw some come in through the chat, but we have a lot in the Q&A, and that'll be the easiest place for us to manage them. So please post it there. But let's jump right in. A lot of people are actually asking a very similar question of when should accommodations be requested? When is the right time to ask for that? Is it during the interview? Is it as you're accepting the offer? Should you wait until your first day? What's the timing around that?
Yeah, and I don't mean for this to sound like a roundabout answer, but the right answer, in my opinion, is it's up to you. It is something that you need, or if it's something that you need, I would hate for you to feel that you cannot ask for the reasonable accommodation that you need, and the absence of that accommodation negatively impact how you perform in the hiring process, the interview process, or in your job. So I would say, again, if you need that accommodation, if you know that you'll need the accommodation, I recommend asking as soon as possible. It can also help to establish a bit of trust with your either manager or the interviewer, the employer that you're interviewing with, and show that you are taking a chance to be open and honest, potentially educate them as well if it seems that maybe they're not as familiar with the topic, depending on how they respond to that. Whereas again, you can say, hey, I did find the accommodation statement, is this the right way for me to go? It shows that you've also done some research on your end, kind of speaking to your skill set and characteristics. But all of that being said, I do recognize as well that it might not always feel like you can ask for that needed accommodation without then fear of being viewed or treated differently. There might be a hesitation because you don't know how that person is going to react, if it will impact your chances of being hired. It really is synonymous with just the disclosure piece and discussion around that as well. And when you ultimately feel comfortable to disclose having a disability. So the answer is it's up to you, and those are the reasons why I recommend doing it as early as possible. But again, if you don't need an accommodation for the hiring process and you need it for, let's say, the job, but you're wondering if they could in fact provide that, it would be, I feel like, an unfortunate scenario to be in that job and then find out that they can't provide you what you need.
Perfect. And then that kind of brings me to this next question. And this may cross over into the legality territory. So, Sarah, if it does, we can, go right past it. Just as a reminder, we're not here to give legal advice. But Tamara said she once had an employer tell her that because she didn't disclose her disability at the time she was hired, she wasn't able to request accommodations. So she wants to know, is that something that employers can actually say? Does that cross over into maybe some illegal territory? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And again, I am not a lawyer. I'm not a trained legal professional. So I cannot recommend, what should in fact be done. But what I can say is that no, you are able and allowed to request an accommodation at any time. Again, self-disclosure is a personal choice. It cannot be held against you if you do not self-disclose, if you do not self-identify. That's entirely within your rights to determine when you want to do that or if you want to do that. So from my understanding of the situation, that would absolutely be further discussion with an employer or whoever you felt comfortable with, because that shouldn't be the case at all. You should be able to request an accommodation at any time. And that also goes along with the fact that understanding over 80% of disabilities are acquired within our lifetime. It's the one category, within this space we say we'll all be lucky to fall into if we're lucky to live long enough. So if you acquire a disability later on in life, let's say that you are diagnosed with something, you couldn't have requested that accommodation at the time that you were hired because you didn't have a disability then. It was something that you've acquired through your career, through your tenure within the company. So absolutely, it should not be something that's held against you because you didn't disclose it up front.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful and definitely answers that question. Teresa here reported that she's seen an online job application for a Fortune 500 company, and they asked if you had a disability, but they noted the question was optional. Is that the correct way for them to go about their online applications? Is that something we should look out for?
Yeah, I think it again depends on how it is asked. I know employers do ask general demographic information. I think to a degree, every employer's application process is a little different. Unfortunately, if you apply for a job with 6 different companies, the application might be different for all 6 of those. Is not going to be standard in any kind of way, but across the board, I think it is pretty standard for employers to ask that, again, depending on how it's asked and what is asked and how that data is being used. I think it's okay, but it should be clear as to why that type of information, demographic information, is being asked, or there should be an option to always say, I prefer not to answer, or give you an option to kind of opt out.
Perfect. An anonymous attendee asks, they said, so my accommodation is to have 3 days of sick time every 6 months. Would it benefit me to add that I can do all that is needed for the job just with a flexible work schedule? So I think that question is essentially asking, how specific do we need to get when we're asking for accommodations? This person they want to know, can I just say that I can do the job, but I will need accommodations of a flexible work schedule? Or do they need to give those specifics of, I need 3 days every 6 months to do my job?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, I would recommend, going back to the tips of being upfront and asking for what you need, ultimately to set yourself up for success. But also be prepared to share some general information as to what you need, why you need it, and reiterate exactly what that person said of, it doesn't impact my ability to do the job. I am absolutely able to still meet the essential functions and requirements of this job, and even beyond that, I will excel in this role. Really sell yourself. Let them know that's not a problem. But be prepared if they do have questions. What would that flexible schedule look like? How often would you need a shift or a change in the days that you're working? So it's up to you if you want to address that up front and give those details, or kind of wait for the question and then let them know. If it's any kind of peace of mind as well, this, flexible work schedules, we say that as an example for people with disabilities, but people without disabilities as well. I have been a caregiver myself, and I've needed a flexible work schedule because of that. Even though I myself do not have a disability or identify with one, I am also a parent to a toddler. So I've also needed a flexible work schedule many times, or just on the fly needed one to pick up my child from daycare, or to, accommodate when she's sick and I have to just watch her full time. Sometimes making those points as well. Not just from an education standpoint, and just to have maybe this person feel a little bit better, that 3 days every 6 months really isn't much at all. That also might be something that you can just use PTO for if you have that, or use your designated sick days if you have that. So just some options there on what you want to disclose and what you don't want to disclose.
Yeah, I think that's a great point of, looking for companies that are offering these benefits that are completely inclusive of, not just, helping people with accommodations or who need accommodations, but like you said, you're a caregiver. They also need flexible schedules. I think most of us are going to argue that we need a flexible schedule at this point. So maybe if you're looking at a company that offers unlimited PTO, well, that's going to help you make sure that
Yep.
you can get your work done. And that leads me into my next question of, how are employers going about recruiting people with disabilities? And on the flip side, I want to know, where can we go to look for companies that are recruiting people with disabilities? And what are some things we should look out for to know that they're kind of, in a disability friendly, I guess you could say, employer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Employers are some of the things that employers are doing to attract and to hire. I will tell you that every company, a kind of a trend within talent acquisition right now, is to focus on the brand. And that is something that you can probably just it makes sense. That's kind of common sense that an employer would heavily invest in that, especially knowing that more and more job seekers are turning to social media, like a LinkedIn, like a Twitter, going to the careers page, looking for things like a designated diversity and inclusion page on the website and calling out everything that they have to offer, like employee resource groups, business resource groups, competitive benefits, showing that they have flexible schedules, showing that they have unlimited PTO, that they have competitive parental leave as well, additional sick days, something competitive in terms of medical benefits, anything that they especially have received feedback on from their own employees, potentially with disabilities, or just knowing from the space and the population that this is something that we would really like to see. It's the same thing for me as a woman. I always like to see companies that have representation within their leadership groups, on their websites, within stock images. To see women in those pictures, to even see Asian women within those pictures is amazing. But same thing, more and more employers are understanding the impact of showing that we do have employees with disabilities already within our companies. Here's a bit of their story. And you're going to see more companies doing this. They're not necessarily, at least the employers that I've spoken to that we work with, they're trying to be very sensitive around the fact that they don't want any employee to ever feel like that poster child. And they're not trying to show any kind of inaccurate portrayal of representation that they have within the company. But instead of giving a generic statement of we're committed to hiring people with disabilities or to do diversity and inclusion, it's instead, why don't you hear from an employee? Read about their story, read about their experiences. At least for me, that goes a much longer way than reading a generic statement from an organization. So those are some of the things that you can look out for. Look for more of those benefits. Look for more employee testimonials. Look for them to specifically call out the inclusion of people with disabilities and what they're doing to be inclusive there. One place that you can go, there are a lot of places that you can go. Getting Hired site has 100 plus organizations that we're working with. All of those companies are working with us to, yes, not only post all of their jobs to our site, and it's all of the jobs that they have on their career site on our site. They don't pick and choose. So same experience there as if you went to their career site, but you can know those employers are also receiving trainings on understanding the impacts of bias, especially around people with disabilities when they're reviewing resumes, when they're conducting interviews in the onboarding process, understanding what they are legally allowed to say and not say. So in a sense, a version of this presentation, to know what job seekers' rights are and to know what they can say and not say, and to understand what they are, what the appropriate way is to respond. So if a job seeker, we go through an exercise, we say, if a job seeker discloses a disability to you, what's the appropriate way to respond? And one of the things we say is, you can thank them for sharing that information, ask if they need to request a reasonable accommodation, and leave it at that. You don't need to ask anything else personal. You don't have to be overly worried about not being empathetic enough, because I think that's a lot of times where the worry comes from. And then where they start to ask questions that they shouldn't be asking, they're trying to be very personal, very empathetic. They don't want you to feel like they've given you the cold shoulder. So if that answers your question, that's probably a little bit more that you can look for in at least one resource of where you can go.
Yeah, I think that's a great advice. And then that note about looking towards their culture and who is in their top leadership positions and what are they saying about this? Not just, we want to be an inclusive workplace. That's great, but what are they doing? What are the specific actions they're taking? Do they dive deeper than that? And I'd also recommend looking for conversations like this that aren't just being hosted by Getting Hired and Fairygodboss, but what companies are getting involved in these conversations? What companies are, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, putting their money where their mouth is, kind of a thing. And those are where you're going to want to look to when you're on your job hunt. So with that brings us to the end of time today. So thank you once again, Sarah, for your time with us. This was a really informative presentation. Thank you for taking time to answer all of our questions. And then do you have any closing thoughts before I wrap things up?
Yeah, I wanted to thank everybody for joining. Sam, thank you for putting this together, and Fairygodboss for having me, for having Getting Hired. And it's just so important for all of us to know our rights and what employers can and can't ask us. Sometimes it is going to feel like you're going out on a limb to stand up for yourself, but it is an education point for that employer. And it's each of our responsibilities. I think it's within all of our rights to be able to advocate for ourselves and for others who might be going through something similar. So as much as I can empower everybody to do that, that's just kind of my takeaway message there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And she's right. It's your life, your career. You should stand up for yourself. Thank you, everyone, for spending the last hour with us here today. We will send out the recording as well as more information about getting hired straight to your inbox by the end of the day today. So be on the lookout for that. And I hope to see you all at the next Fairy God Boss webinar. Catch you in the next one. Bye.
Thank you all.